I'm here. Unfortunately, you're going to get two sessions from me because Gary asked me to also chair the next panel session, but I will just be introducing and helping along. But this is, what I'm about to present to you is probably different to you've heard throughout the day. You know, there's a lot of discussion today already about, you know, the major issues in UK in terms of skills, you know, mega issues, finance. We can do that, and I look forward to talking to some of you this evening over dinner about those. But what I really wanted to really spend time on, given my background and, you know, what I had to do for many years at Imagination, which was creating technologies that you go and sell to the most difficult and biggest customers that have 100 times capability of you, but you still had to capability to go and do so. So I want to I've had the time to reflect, having left Imagination 3 years ago. I'm now working with a bunch of companies, and I will give you a little bit of context about that so that you know roughly what I'm doing. But I'm going to share with you sort of the essence of what I have learned in the last 20 years about what drives innovation and what really matters. And I keep telling my startups to remember these things, and as they grow, do more of what it's required. So what I'm going to cover today, introduction is not about me. Gary did that already. I want to spend 4 or 5 minutes talking about some of the companies I'm working with now, because that gives you a context. But really, I want to talk about disruptive innovation, and then the process about you create something that is disruptive enough to globally have an impact, and trends that you have to take into account. I also want to highlight the rules are changing, and I will give you some high-level example why they are changing and what that means in terms of the approach we have to take here in UK. So in terms of companies that I'm working with, I have 2 pages on this. Just to, I've forgotten exactly how many, but 12 to 15 companies that I work with. And I got about 8 of them very quickly, and the purpose for highlighting those is not really a sell thing, but I want to tell you, give you an idea that you have about the kind of things I do and why I focus on those things. So a lot of you know Ultra Haptics. This is a sort of truly disruptive tech and disruptive, and you'll see when I talk about innovation, it's something that tech is disruptive, the application is also new and disruptive, and it's all about using, bringing touch, you know, all my life, last 20 years, the focus about creating virtual reality, etc., in terms of visual stuff. This is about creating virtual touch, which completely transforms the way you interact with devices. The second company, Unify, is a very interesting, it's a small company. I mean, Ultra Haptics is about 100 people now, and we've had 3 or 4 rounds of funding, and it's going from strength to strength. Unify is an early stage company, and it's focused on, and it is, actually, both of them are hardware and software companies. I'm cool about hardware companies as long as there's a platform behind them, and it's not just about selling hardware at 35% margin. You know, if there's a platform there, that's okay. So Unify is about creating, bringing touch technology to everyday devices. You know, if you have experienced the last 10 years, you know, touch is relatively new. Only 10 years ago, we had the first phones and things, and generally seems to be a flat screen and you touch. What Unify does, using optics technology, and you're able to create curved surfaces, you know, touch goes around the product. The reason I really like that, because it gives freedom in design. You can have a very very complex user interface wrapped around the product without having to worry about the usual things that you have to do. So it basically makes it really simplistic. The last 2 companies on the list are hardware companies, but mostly at this stage I would say software. Mindtrace, I mean, some of these people, the CEOs and people are in the audience here. Mindtrace, you know, we've talked about AI, and we'll do a session this afternoon. A lot of AI today is about training a network with lots of input. And to me, you know, if I'm being a mathematician, it's like a matching system. You know, you bring a new pattern and you say, oh, okay, it lacks the one I saw so many times before. That's great, it works for computers. But if you're really honest, and you look at a child or a human being, that's not what we do. You can introduce a human being to a new situation, and they will be able to apply their previous knowledge to this completely new situation without having to be trained. So in practice, it should be possible to have machines that think for themselves and learn from one situation and go to the other. And I'm interested in it because I look at intelligence. I mean, my simplistic way about it is like, you should be able to have alphabets of intelligence in the current situation. You say, these are the elements that determine the sequence of events a human being will go about something, and you should be able to pick those up and apply them to something else. And then Articulate is another example of a company. I think the way I will describe it is one of those companies that has picked up the trends of their smartphones with a lot of power on them. We have good connectivity, and we have a lot of AI technology, and what this company does, or is focused on, is to help people speak a language better. And what I mean by that, if you imagine you pick up your phone, and like me, you come from another part of the world, and you have an accent, and you can speak, and the system will listen to you and interact with you and help you through speaking fluently. And I think it's globally impactful application, and it allows people to communicate better, both professionally and on personal front. So just another example of the companies I'm working with is Teams, which is very unusual in the sense that this is a platform company, and the way I look at it, it's the next generation way of enabling a network for working people, bringing people who want to work, whether they freelancers or remotely, to jobs that exist. But it's a bit, I'm sure you heard crowdsourcing, but this is not about simply crowdsourcing. It's about enabling virtual teams to come together and apply for significant roles and jobs that exist around the globe. I think the world of work is changing, and it means people have to be able to work from home, for a variety of reasons, pollution being one, and we have very high performance internet capabilities, and the ability to bring people together into teams. Think about it of a way of creating virtual companies that participate in the working environment. And I won't spend too much time on that, just to give you an idea. The next two companies actually are focused on medical application. Neurophenix is hardware company, as you said. When you mention hardware, it does become more difficult to raise funding. But provided there's a platform between it, i.e. you have a cloud system that you're using the hardware to collect the data and adjust your service. And Neurophenix is about delivering a service for stroke patient. Basically they interact with a device that monitors their capabilities, and then with the help of the medical people behind the scene and intelligence in the system, you can guide them through and advise them. And that is really valuable. And Cocoon is similar, but it's for sleep. It's about, again, monitoring people and their environment and how deep their sleep is and adjusting the content. And last but not least is a truly hardware company, which is about generating high-end capable video solution for recording. This is purely about getting the latest and greatest technologies out there into the hands of people who need them. Anyway, so that gives you a sort of rough idea. So the context that I'm going to say the next few slides is in relation to my work at Imagination for 20 years and the last 3 years working with startup companies, both raising funding, adjusting this strategy, being very clear what they do and why they do it. And actually, most of my companies have hardware, and they all have been able to achieve to get funding for their activities. Now, innovation, I really want, when people talk about innovation, it's very important to understand there's sort of a scope for it, in the sense that depending on the technology and the processes or business models that you're creating and the target market or application, you can describe innovation into these 4 boxes. In the sense that if it is existing technology in existing market, is incremental improvement. incremental innovations. On the other hand, if you have new technology in a new market, it's completely radical. I would imagine ultra haptic, I will put them into a radical innovator, and I will put, if you have new technology, existing market, like Unify, the touch company, falls into that category. It's very important, I think, for companies to know who they are and what is it they're trying to achieve. Now, the area that you create differentiation and invention, which we need to do in UK, really tends to be on the right-hand side. So my point to you is we'd be better off focusing on companies that are focused in disruptive or radical innovations. Now, when you do these kind of high-tech companies, there's always risk around what you do. As a Japanese friend of mine used to say, in life, there's risk and rewards. And his motto in life was he wanted to do things which were low risk, high reward, which I'm sure you all agree with. But in practice, you'll find that in business, as long as you do, whether it's low risk or high risk, if the high reward is at the end of it, and you manage your risk, is not an unreasonable thing to do. But when you do these kind of innovation, you really have to look at the risk, the reward and the relevance between those two. The timeline, sometimes, some investors have a 5-year time horizon or 3-year time horizon. You can't sort of, expect to deliver in a time frame that their fund has to achieve the result, so it won't really work. And of course, the scale that innovation may have in terms of the area that is targeted, or the impact, whether it's in a specific area or multiple market. And finally, the value that is perceived. Now, the key point I wanted to take, unfortunately, all of this was much easier a few years ago, because all of this is now have to happen or is happening in a very changing environment. And this is really, I wanted to talk about the crystal ball of innovation. In my view, if you sitting down and having to guesstimate the future, which in UK, the kind of the economy we have, we really have to do that kind of stuff, be at the leading edge in order to have the differentiation that we need. One of the very important things is consumer and societal habits and trends. We really have to understand that. It's not really good enough for even a small tech company in UK to say, you know what, that's not my problem. I develop the tech, and then my customer worries about that. It is really important, if you're creating a technology in UK, you really think about, does it really have the impact you expect it to have in the consumer world, even if you're not the end supplier. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. The other trend is the technology trends and disruption. This is what most companies do. Actually, they do it reasonably well. The first one, they don't do it, and they get into trouble as a result of it. And the last, but not least, is the industry and business structural evolution. One of the things startup companies need to really concentrate on, or even growth companies who's selling or want to be sold at the end, is that the ecosystem they operate in it is changing. Their customers or the customers of customers are changing. The environment is changing. If you create a product, by the time it's done and arrived, the world has moved on, is really not a good thing. So you have to understand the mega trends in the industry. And I will touch some of those issues in a little bit to really get to the bottom of it. So, summary is, even for a tech company who is generating some underlying tech, it's really important to understand the underlying trends and disruptions that could happen. And I've highlighted those three things in terms of consumer, tech, and the ecosystem, or the food chain, if you like. Those are the three things. And I'm going to talk about those things a little bit. First of all, consumer one. Ultimately, whether you B2C, B2B, whatever, at the end of the day, if a consumer does not take a benefit from the product, it won't work, because the B2B company that is buying from you, they all, at some point, they end up with a consumer. And generally, consumers, in my experience, buy stuff if it makes their life easier, make them happier, healthier, or saves the planet, which is sort of the new thing that has some importance. But that's really not enough. One of the things that has really baffled me, and I'm going to share with you some points, is that the way the society or consumers work today looks very erratic. You know, if you look the kind of election results we've had around the world, or our Brexit, you wonder what the hell is going on here. So I'm just going to give you some theories, what I think is going on, and see whether you agree, because it has a consequence on what we do. I think human societies, historically, when we were small tribes, they were very tribal. You know, the tribal leader had power. So the witch doctor, or whatever his name was, had a position, and there was a structure in that tribe that people observed. As the time went on, we got to a hierarchical society whereby religion came in, and you know, we had pretty significant religion around the world where, you know, whether they're churches or other things, that there was an environment in which people operated in a certain way. Could be, you know, societies with hierarchy, with governments and, you know, positions and etc., etc. Then, you know, some 20, 30, 40 years ago, someone said, you know what really matters is to be market driven. You know, we have to create products that consumers would want to buy, etc. As I said here, you know, I shop, therefore I exist kind of thing. So we became very much consumer focused, creating stuff for the consumers, etc. But what has happened in the recent time is that the society has become extremely networked through the real-time connections, which are social media. And as my picture there suggests, we've ended up with people really disregarding the normal infrastructure around them, whether it's the hierarchical thing that historically was there, the social network having too much impact or too much influence for what people stand for, what they believe in. You know, they get their news there. Could be, you know, you could even inject fake news in that environment. So you're not dealing with a society that is influenced hugely by this connection that is through social media. Now, fortunately, we're seeing some correction in that space. People are being more aware, you know, these echo chambers or bubble stuff that there's people of the similar mind sit there and talk to each other and ignore the different opinion. You know, there's more awareness of it. So hopefully things are moving forward. But the point I'm making, if you're creating product for this society, you really have to be aware that this is going on. You have to get your data because the decisions that people make are not in the normal hierarchical environment. They are being formed in this social media. And you have, as a company, you have to engage with it and understand what is going on there. Now, I really don't want to spend too much on this slide because I really want to make a point on the next slide. This one, you probably all know. What I'm really highlighting here is that, in my opinion, in my assessment, or the areas I'm interested, the next areas of importance, you know, of course, mobile continue to be important, but for a different set of reasons. The healthcare and biologics, I'm particularly interested in it because I think the crossover of technology and human body and medicine is really an exciting area to make an impact. And of course, the IoT hasn't happened, but it must happen. We should be able to use the connectivity and IoT to do a better job. And then the other key areas, I'm sure you don't disagree with these, you know, the all high performance computing, and I put in all VR and AR in that section. Then robotics, generic robot, particularly intelligent robots, and lastly automotive. You know, I can talk about all of this, but just briefly, for example, in automotive, if you look at it, really there are 4 mega trends. One is electrification, autonomous driving. The way user interfaces have to be and of course the infrastructure. So if you begin to understand the key point in each one of these things and see what really matters, if you went through all of that, you really conclude in terms of underlying technologies that drive all of these things. Sort of summarized some of the key ones there, machine learning, of course, virtual augmented reality, haptics for user interfaces, cloud technology, material science that you need to have in order to back some of these stuff. And then not only that, you have the normal other infrastructure around them in terms of security, power that was discussed, sensor, advanced packaging, and memory technologies. Now, the point I really want to make about this slide is not the details there, but is this point, which is significant innovations from now on would be multidisciplinary. It is really difficult to make a mega impact with a simple or a single technology. What I mean by that, in order to create a car that is safely drives around and is useful and saves, has a degree of autonomous capabilities, you have to bring many, many technologies and many experts into it. Someone said earlier, system people. Yes, that is the reality, because the innovations of the future are much, much more complicated. And in fact, I've sort of tried to simplify these things by saying if you categorize them into physical, digital, I'm particularly interested in biological, so those three categories. The best areas of innovation is where they overlap. There's some overlap between those things and you have biggest impact. But the key point I'm really making here is that the new products and services will have strong multidisciplinary foundations, and therefore diversity of technology, understanding diversity of technology and processes and even business models really critical. These things are not simple anymore. And the key point there, the crystal ball needs to have a diversity of knowledge in tech and science. Now, the third point I had on my crystal ball was the industry dynamic or the food chain, etc. I want to, for those of you as old as me, you remember this. When I went to my first job, the food chain was really simple. You had the semiconductor guys, then OEM made some products using those. There was retailers, and maybe in some cases like TV and phone, some operator, and then the consumer. Life was very straightforward. You knew who you were selling to, who was buying what from whom. And then, life started getting interesting. The IP vendors came in and started moving some of the technology out, ARM and Imagination and others. Foundries made it possible for other channel, making it accessible, silicon accessible to other people. And then ODM start making pretty complicated devices. You can pay $4 million and get your own smartphone designed if you really want from scratch. You can specify every detail of it. And then, as if that was not enough, a few years ago we ended up with internet, online content, online retailers, internet apps, and social media. All sort of was still, so it was just like a new channel. But actually, other things have happened. Platform businesses model has come about. We have the companies like Uber and others, etc. I'll come back to that in a minute. The key point here is the battle. You have to understand what the ultimate battle is about consumer loyalty and lock-in. That is the battle. Everything else is secondary. When we sit here and talk about whether we'll be able to pay $300,000 to engineers, you can't do that if you cannot lock huge number of customers in your ecosystem and make enough money to do it. So just, we, as a country, we need to understand that and see what is it we have to do to make a difference. And then you see that graph has been responsible for a number of companies who've been asleep at the wheel that have disappeared on the last 10 years. And I'm giving you some example. I was partly responsible for this change. So, we had basically the Europeans, unfortunately, because they didn't react, they were not interested to move with the new trends, which was smartphones, etc. They lost market share, and you have the new guys that come up. And Google's business model meant the Samsung and Huawei were also successful. If Google didn't do what it did, i.e. if it didn't make all the technology available, it wouldn't, that landscape would have been different. But I just want to make a point. Things have cycled, and this was the last big cycle, but it's not over yet. This is history. So I'm really interested now to ask you some questions, if you don't mind. My claim is business environment has changed, and it's very dynamic and very competitive. So I'm going to ask you a question. See how many people know this. Average age of companies in 1937. Any views? 75 years. That's how long they lasted. Second question, you can guess I was going to ask that. Average age of companies in 2018. 14 years. Okay? Now, what this means is a simple question, but means 75% of today's Fortune 500s would not exist by 2027. So whoever tells you it'll be all the same, just talking nonsense. 2027, 75% of companies that we know today would not exist. That, again, we as a country, we have to understand that, and we have to do stuff to be ready for that, be part of that change. So, and unless they innovate and change, I mean, there has been, for me, one of the companies that has fought this amazingly well is Microsoft. You know, they've almost lost it, but they've come back in a big way. So that's an example of how a company can change and survive. And my previous slide showed you all the ones that didn't change, and look what happened. So, new business model, new rules apply. What do I mean by that? The largest retailer does not have any stores. Do you agree? Amazon is a retailer. They don't really have any stores. Not today. The largest taxi company does not own any taxis. I mean, it's really funny. We say taxi company, but they don't own any taxis. The largest content company does not create its own content. Correct? And then lastly, the most valuable automotive business today has no cars. You know, go and check the valuation. It's almost, I think it was, when I wrote this, it was the most valuable. It may be a few billion around, I don't know. But this is really the key point I want people to pay attention to. This is the phase that is changing everything now. So basically, the crystal ball you look has got to be agile, and more importantly, it has to understand the big picture, the mega trends, what is happening in the ecosystem. So, my final remarks. If you want to have a crystal ball as a company, or even as a country, and make sure you get there, of course, you have to understand those three things. There's the consumer aspect, the technology, and of course the industry mega trends, as I highlighted earlier. And very importantly, your crystal ball better be connected. It better be data-driven. It better have diversity of knowledge and science. It better be agile. And it also have big picture aware. If you do all that, that might just about give you the perfect way of predicting the future and being successful. Anyway, I hope you found this useful and interesting, and maybe it took a little bit longer, but I really wanted to make the points. Thank you.